Jeff, so what's our theme text for this program?
Well, we have a Bible verse from Galatians chapter 6, verse 7. And as I read this, some people, as we go into our subject, are going to say, what in the world does this have to do with what we're talking about? But they're going to find out, though. Yeah, they'll find out by the time we get to the end. But Galatians 6:7 says, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he also reap."
You mentioned that it's going to appear that that we're off the subject from that text, because we're going to start talking about children, and I think that our viewers are going to like how this ends up.
Some of them already maybe have a little light coming on.
But anyway, and we're not talking about, you know, what shall we sow, shall we reap, and if yours turned out bad, you must have been bad. That's not what this is about.
And there are a lot of adult parents that are on big guilt trips because they did the best they could, and they had some situations that turned out that wasn't the way that they were hoping it would.
Anyway, let me start out by asking you, I know you and you know me, but maybe that our viewers don't know either one of us, but they're going to now. And you have children. I know you do.
Yeah, I often
tell us about your children.
I often tell people I have my quiver full, like David said. You know? He said, I have 4 children, and one of them is 23, one is 21, and then there's this big 7-year gap, and then I have a boy who is 14, and I have a daughter who's 12. And so it's like I have these 2 different sets of families, you know, that, and actually that's been a blessing because the mistakes that we made on the first ones, we can try to redeem on the second ones. At the same time, we're trying to redeem the mistakes that we made with the first ones still today as young adults.
Well, so you're just saying in a way it was like having 2 families.
But the same parents. I want to make that clear.
Of course. No, in fact, I was going to ask your wife last night when I heard that there was space. I thought, is this all the same set?
And this was not Planned Parenthood, by the way.
Oh. Okay. Well, anyway, Betty and I have 4 children, and we have 8 grandchildren. Ooh. And you know, I don't want to hurt anybody's feelings, but there was a time in which getting married was about having children. Now, are you hearing what I'm saying?
Maybe you should clarify just a little bit for me, some of the viewers.
Well, what I'm saying is that in certain of our more so-called materialistic cultures or whatever, some people even think, well, you know, I want to get married, but I don't want to have children. I think there was.
You hear that a lot more in society.
Well,
today.
or
because we're oriented towards going out and having a career.
Get into our careers.
The kids get in the way. I mean, let's face it. Some people say, I don't want any kids because they're just going to get in the way. We don't have time.
You know, I was talking with someone over in Africa. It was a lady and her husband had gone over as missionaries, and she was telling me the story how that before they went overseas, that she went to her sister's wedding, and so she said to her sister, you know, how many children are you and John planning to have? And her sister said, well, we don't think we're going to reproduce ourselves.
Oh, man.
But there was a time in which families was about children, and maybe it was about having lots of children. Now that was probably it's in a culture where children were part of the factory, shall we say?
Yeah, the workforce.
It was the workforce, but life has changed a lot, and so having really large families these days can be complicated because we've become, instead of rural, we're becoming largely urbanized. And so what I'm saying is not that we should think of having as many children as possible, but I am saying something about pro-children.
Yes.
I think that God meant for us when we can. And to the best of our ability.
And we touched on another program already, if our viewers were interested in getting a copy of the tape, that talked about, you know, the quality time that's so essential if we are going to have children, to make a family unit, to really be a unit. And, you know, like we said, we already discussed that on another program.
On another program. A family is an obligation. There's no doubts about that. You know, we have 2 boys and 2 girls. How did it end up for you?
We had 3 girls and 1 boy, and I feel sorry for Ben because we're the only 2 male in the house, you know, when all the family's home. And that can be pretty brutal sometimes, you know.
I don't know if you had the experience that Betty and I had, you know, the boys and the girls, but we were over in Pakistan, and that's where our youngest son was born. And I'll never forget the day I saw him crawling on the ground with a stick. Now, we're talking about somebody here who couldn't have been much more than a year old. And he's crawling along with his stick, and he's going,
How old was he?
I don't think he was much more than a year old. And here he is, a little baby boy.
Where did this guy pick this up?
That's the question.
That's the question. It's like the lady I was telling you about that wrote this dissertation, her graduate thesis dissertation, she was not married, about the only reason that boys and girls are different is because of our social and cultural and educational processes within our society that causes them to be that way. And of course, we know that probably does affect kids when they get older to a certain degree. Sure. But all of a sudden, you know, she got a job as a social worker, she had a girl. And she noticed her little girl gravitated towards dolls and things like that. And then she had a little boy, and she had to take her whole thesis and throw it out the window.
No, I don't know. I'm not, you know, a scientist in these kinds of things.
Neither of us are.
But I can say from experience, I have a little grandson now, and his name is Ryan. And here he's barely a year old. And he's climbing around on stuff. He's just being real, what we would call really a boy. And who's taught him? I mean, he hasn't been around that long.
Well, you know, it's interesting because my two children that are at home right now, they have their bedrooms side by side. And so I can walk down the hallway in our house and I can go by my daughter's bedroom. And I open the door and I just take a peek in there, see what's happening. And her bedroom's all nice and clean. Her bed's made. She's got little stuffed animals on her bed. And she's on the floor and she's cutting out these little pieces of paper and she's putting this one over there and she's playing story, you know, and putting that one over there and she's doing this and she's doing that. And I walk by my son's bedroom, open the door. It's a mess. I mean, there's piles of clothes everywhere, there's posters on the walls, there's things hanging off the bunk bed, and he's in there and he's building something with his Legos or something, and he's in there, bombing stuff, you know, and you just opening these different doors are different revelations of the fact that, hey, there's a difference between boys and girls. But you know what's scary? Is these boys and girls grow up, and you know what they do? They get married, and they have kids. And they start as big kids raising little kids.
Well, and I think what you're saying is that being boys and girls when we're little people is that when we begin to be men and women, as we had different perspectives as little children, as when we get to be adults, I think these differences continue.
Oh, absolutely. And if they're not recognized, it can create some really serious dynamics in the family circle.
You know, let me say something about us men. I guess the women would have to, talk about themselves, but from
if you pick on the men, it's okay.
Well, from a man's perspective, one of the things that's very frustrating to me, Jeff, has to do with Christmas and birthdays.
Why is that?
Well, because I'm expected to buy my wife a gift.
Oh boy, here we go.
I
know where you're going already.
I don't know what to get her. I really don't know what to get her.
But she's expecting you to know what she wants.
See, I want her to tell me. See, now I know what you're saying. You see, if I have to ask her, then that means I really don't care. But you see, to me, I would feel so good if she would say, Dick, you know what I'd like for my birthday? I'd like this. I'd go out and I'd get it, and I'd just feel so good.
That's because men are not shoppers, men are hunters.
But on the other hand, see, women, it seems to me, and I don't know if Betty's just special in this respect. You see, Betty wants to give sort of a gift of love. And now, she'll be mad.
A feeling gift.
Yeah, a feeling gift. So, now, she may be mad when I say this, but sometimes she buys me stuff I don't want.
I'm sure
no, it's not that I'm not appreciative, but see, I wish she would come to me and say, Dick, what do you want for your birthday?
I think it shows a little bit of the fact that what we started out with here, there's a difference between boys and girls. There's a difference between young women and young men. There's a difference between men and women.
In perspective, we had an interesting experience because I think that we men tend to be problem solvers, and I don't know that we can make a total generality.
You can't make a clear statement across the board.
That it's never any other way.
There's women who are problem solvers, but generally speaking,
us men tend to be problem solvers, and the women are maybe more about feelings. They're more about feelings. I got back from a trip the other day, and I walked into the house, and Betty was sitting on the couch. And she was kind of she wasn't saying anything. In fact, looked a little sad. Well, I didn't pay much attention to that until about 15 minutes later. She's still sitting on the couch, and she's still looking sad.
Get your attention, Dick. Get your attention here.
I said, honey, what's wrong? She said, baby cake died. Baby cake is the parakeet. Now, baby cake is very important in our lives because we got...
How long ago was this?
No, this just happened.
This just happened?
And so baby cake died. We'd had baby cake. We got baby cake when we were raising our granddaughter, Andrea. So baby cake is not just a parakeet we appreciate, but it represents a lot of feelings.
A lot of feelings.
And so
memories.
And so you know what I did? Here goes this man's mind again. Here she's done.
Problem solver.
I'm a problem solver. So now baby cake hadn't been feeling well. I mean, he'd been sitting around with his head under his wing and everything. And anyway, I thought to myself, I wonder how long parakeets are supposed to live. In other words, did baby cake just die of old age? So I went to the computer, I went to Google, and I typed in parakeets, how long do they live? And there came up an article that said they live 8.5 years. Or 8 years plus.
And how long have you had?
And so I asked Betty, how long did the parakeet live? She said, more than 8 years. And then I thought, well, so that's what you get.
Problem solved.
But you see, what I was doing was, here, I don't care whether they're supposed to live 100 years or 6 months. The fact was, she missed baby cake. Really, what I should have done at that time was not said, well, that's the reason he died. Don't feel bad. He had to go.
His time came.
I should have been more sensitive
compassionate
to her feelings. Well, honey, we're going to miss
Well,
baby
that just shows you the difference between the way men and women think. And you know, we're going into a direction here where we're going to talk about the fact that the way that men and women think affects the way that we raise our kids.
That we raise our kids.
I remember the one story briefly of a man and woman. They were only been married for a year, and the wife was starting to have some real serious doubts about this relationship, you know, and she was talking to one of her friends saying, you know, I made this commitment to this man for the rest of my life, you know, really was this meant to be? And her friend said, well, you know, you need to just talk to your husband, sit down and get some affirmation, you know, settle this question once and for all and move on with your life. And so she decided that's what she was going to do. And so she ended up going home that night, and she was cooking in the kitchen dinner, and her husband came home from work, and he was looking at the newspaper, and he was looking at the newspaper specifically because they had been talking about buying a new used four-wheel drive truck. And so the wife finally, you know, she's nervous. She gets up her courage. She comes to the doorway between the kitchen and the living room. She says, honey, I need to talk to you. And he's like, yeah? And she says, honey, seriously, I need to ask you a question. And he puts the newspaper down enough to look over top of the newspaper and says, what's wrong? And she said, well, I was just wondering, you know, I've really been having some serious thoughts about this whole matter. You know, was this whole thing meant to be? I mean, can you and I mean, can we really pull this off? I mean, can we really do this? Was this whole thing?
Of course, she's thinking about their marriage.
She's thinking about the marriage relationship. And he's sitting there going like, you know, we talked already about whether we can afford a four-wheel drive truck, and you know, we've talked to the lady at the bank, and we can get the loan.
He's thinking that.
He's thinking about, and he goes, honey, don't worry about it. You know, we've discussed this whole thing. It's clear. You know, it's easy. You know, there's no problem here. We can pull it off. This thing was meant to be. It'll work. And she just all of a sudden melts, and she goes over and puts her arm around her husband and kisses him on the cheek and says, I'm so glad I finally got the affirmation I'm looking for. And he's feeling like, wow, she's really getting pretty worked up about buying a four-wheel drive truck. And then she's walking off to the kitchen finally thinking, you know, it's been settled. You know, it's been settled in our relationship. Now I know I've got that affirmation. And then he puts the newspaper down, and she's just walking in the kitchen and says, but honey, can I ask you one last question? And she says, what's that? Do you think we should get an automatic transmission, or should we get a manual 5-speed? And all of a sudden they realize they're not on the same wavelength. Hey, we got to take a break. Just want to let you know that you're watching Laymen Ministries Crosstalk, and we'll be back in just a second.
Laymen Ministries bookstore carries hundreds of books, Bibles, resource materials, videotapes, and audio tapes, all at discounted prices. To receive your free catalog, write or call Laymen Ministries. Or if you would like to receive Richard O'Fill's book, Lord, Keep Your Mansions, Just Save My Children, write Laymen Ministries, 414 Zapata Road, St. Mary's, Idaho, 83861. Or call 1-800-245-1844. That's 1-800-245-1844.
There's a difference between the way that men and women think.
And of course, then this would, as you mentioned before the break, this affects then the way we deal with our children.
Absolutely. And sometimes it can be serious and detrimental.
Particularly the way we would discipline our children. We men, again, I think it's really important that we're problem solvers. If we find a problem, we want very methodically to solve it.
To deal with it.
Where a woman is going to probably tend to be much more about feeling.
And so that tends to a man oftentimes leaning more on the side of justice, on setting rigid rules, you know, and having guidelines and such. And the mother, being more of a feeling type, was like being maybe a little bit more coddling, you know, more forgiving, leaning more on the side of leniency and grace. And I don't know about you, but I can speak from my own personal experience in my family dealing with my kids, is there was times that my wife and I talked about a certain standard, and then the child breaks that standard. And my wife would just let it act like it never happened. And so Justice, father, the problem solver, would step in and say, okay, you know, I deal with this problem with the child. She's not going to do it. I'm going to deal with it. And then the mother feels like, you know, he's being a little bit too harsh, you know, and so she kind of coddles the child later, and then I recognize that she's coddling the child while I'm trying to discipline the child, and gets to be a bigger and bigger gap to finally where, you know, the husband becomes the tyrant. The child looks at the father as being the mean guy.
Or see,
the bad guy.
The mother may actually accept this to the point where she would say to the child, you better look out when your daddy comes home, he's going to get you.
Have you ever heard that? Yeah, oh yeah, I'm going to have a talk with your father. When he gets home, you're going to get a spanking or whatever, you know, you're going to get disciplined.
See, I think what we want to establish is the importance that in raising children, the mother and the father are together. Now, I think you brought out a very interesting point, it seems to me, where you mentioned that the father tends to see the justice side of it.
Absolutely.
And the mother more on the merciful side. But when I think of God, isn't he both justice and mercy? And see, this is why, this is the wonderful thing of marriage. Because I even heard someone say that a complete person is not just a male or just a female, but it's the combination of the male and the female.
The mother and father the husband and wife shall
become one.
Become one. Yeah. And so in a situation like that, the remedy is there's either two different directions you can go. Is that this gap can get bigger and bigger and bigger until where it finally ends up into divorce.
Yeah, that's right.
Fighting between the husband and the wife over the kids. The kids are caught in the middle. And I think it's a very important rule, and I just say this to my viewers, a very important rule. If the husband and wife are disagreeing about disciplining a child, that they never disagree in front of the child. That if there needs to be a timeout, the mother and father need to go into the back bedroom. They need to talk about things. They need to work together as a team so that there's consistency and a united front. My wife and I got to the situation where we were dealing with this child. My one youngest daughter got to where she didn't really even like me anymore because I was being so stern, you know, and my wife was always coddling her and such. And I had to have, we say in Idaho, we came to loggerheads. Now, some people might not identify with that, but we came to a time where my wife and I had to hash out this issue and recognize what we were both doing. And I would suggest to our viewers, you know, if you're having this kind of dilemma in your home, you need to sit down with your husband, your wife, and you need to recognize that we each have these tendencies and these characteristics, and come to the point of saying, okay, what are we going to do about it? And so, you know what my wife and I did? I stepped back from being Mr. Justice, and she realized that she needed to be a little bit more Mrs. Justice. And at the same time, Daddy all of a sudden started to need to be Mr. Merciful.
Right.
And we started to try to switch roles so that my daughter felt comfortable sitting on my lap and I could read a story to her, I could do things with her. I take my kids on special occasions where I just take them off by themselves. You know, like I'll take my youngest daughter out to eat, just her and I, out to eat, because she's my little princess. And that's what I want her to be. I don't want her to look at me as the big mean guy, you know. But a mother and a father need to be united because there needs to be consistency.
But you see, this lack of consistency sometimes will play right into the hands of the child. Because the child then will begin to play off.
And they can do this
and
at a young age.
Play one parent off against the other. In other words, go to mama or go to daddy. Daddy says no, go to mama. She says yes, or vice versa. And so really the child develops these wrong relationships with the parents. And I think what we want to learn ourselves is that as husbands and wives, we have to close ranks. I know Betty and I went through a situation, and I thank God that during that time in which our boy was into drugs and alcohol and so forth.
And I think a lot of all viewers can relate to this.
These are the kinds of things that split marriages, as you've said, because one parent can go and just say, oh, you know, we've got to do, and the other parent stiffens up. But I thank God that during that time, he didn't let the devil split Betty and me, but that we actually closed ranks. Now, I know that it was hard for both of us, but this should be our prayer. And, you know, I was talking with a man, and one time, was I talking to the man or the woman? But anyway, it might have been the woman, and the son had MS in the early stages. And of course, she wanted, for example, to just use natural remedies. The father was a medical doctor.
Oh,
he wanted to go at it in the best way that medical science could approach it, and it was getting tense. She wanting to do natural, he wanting to do a more scientific approach. And you know, I told her, I said, even though you may feel different about this, because this is beginning to manifest itself between you, it's doing what must not be done, because the instability of the home would actually exacerbate the symptoms of this particular disease. So somewhere along the line, they had to close ranks, as you say, and come together.
And they had to, I don't want to use the word compromise, but they had to have a meeting of the mind.
They had to have a meeting of mind. How's it going to be? It can't be. Now, maybe it could be, in some cases, both ways. In other ways, we're going to have to decide how's it going to be and then have a united front.
I think really quickly, I'd like to diverge just for a second, because I think that you and I agree that with a small child, infancy, up to the ages 10, 11 years old, that God has given us the divine right of being kind of like a moral conscience for our kids, to guide and direct them, and the whole concept of discipline, by the way, is not just spanking or time out or whatever. Discipline is actually the act of educating a child that he understands that there's consequences to the choices they make.
And see, this is where we bring this text. This is where we were going, because you read the text at the beginning of the program. Whatsoever we sow, that we will reap. Really, the process then, I believe, as parents raising our children, our challenge is to teach our children the consequences of what they do.
It's a reality check. It's reality training, actually, in such a way.
You see, this brings up a challenge for us as parents, because there are many parents, because of this mercy side, say, well, you know, I know my child's not doing what they ought to do, but I don't want them to suffer. In other words, in a way, discipline might not be just the initiative we take, but it might be in actually not doing anything so that the child can feel the brunt of what they've done. This is especially important when they get older.
And that's the next point I was going to bring out. You know, is there's this area from infancy up till about 11 years old. We are being conscious to them. We're disciplining them in an educational process. And then as they get to be 12 to 18 years old, there needs to be like a weaning of that disciplinary action, as far as guiding their conscience and setting down the moral parameters for them, so that they start experimenting on their own, putting into practice the foundation that we've already established in those first 12 years of life, so that they can start making more of their own choices. Because ultimately what needs to happen is when a child gets to be 18, 19, 20 years old, they are an adult. They are their own individual, and we have established now a relationship with them that's no longer a mother and daughter, or a father and a son, or vice versa, that they are actually adults in which we are friends. And you know, there's some parents that never cut loose. I know people who are 60 years old and they're still treating their 45-year-old daughter or son as a little kid. And the kid, they don't want to even be around their parents, because mom and dad are still being mom and dad. And there's got to be a point that we step back and we enter into like a personal relationship where we treat them just as we treat anybody else, and they can confide in us and know that we're friends with them.
Do you know, I think you mentioned the fact that our children become adults when they're 18 or, you know, whatever.
20.
This is very arbitrary, because really when they begin to be what some have called tweens, in other words, maybe 12, 13 years old, they begin to prepare themselves to go out on their own. And so where before that time we could be, as you say, conscious to them, that during those years we cannot have the control over the children that we used to have.
We have to start stepping back.
And now stepping back.
And that's where you're talking about letting them suffer the consequences of
their
their own choices.
They must begin. Now we set the parameters. This doesn't mean, well, if you want to just borrow my car so you can drive it off a cliff, you're welcome to it. And so we'll set certain parameters. But there comes a time in which we can't be the conscience for our children.
Absolutely.
There comes a time in which we have to understand that our children are going to make their own decisions, and they're going to suffer those decisions.
And you know, one of the things I praise God about in my family, that even though that my older daughters especially have gone off and done some pretty crazy things, and you and I, we could compare notes and say, boy, you know, we've blown it, and these kids have made some wrong choices too at the same time, and they're guilty of those choices. They have to suffer the consequences. Our kids have felt comfortable enough with us that they let us know the good, the bad, and the ugly, because we're still friends with them. And I at least think, well, that's one thing maybe I did right in my, my first set of kids that we were raising.
Well, but I don't think that you're saying that we reach the place where we're not parents. It's it's just that at one point we become more than parents.
We become more than parents. We become friends.
We become friends also.
Counselors and friends.
Because when they see us as parents, see, to a child, daddy means control my life.
It's like I was sharing with you that my daughter sometimes, she does something in her life, and I know she's expecting the lecture from dad. I don't give the lecture from dad. I wait until the appropriate time to be able to just share just a few choice thoughts, and I just leave it at that. And that has much more bigger impact than every time something happens, I say, well, I told you so. No, how many parents, I told you so. But this comes down to another whole dynamic, Dick, is that in order to discipline our kids, we have to learn to discipline ourselves. That's kind of what we're talking about here.
Well, see, because ultimately, life has to be about self-discipline. We discipline our children so that they can learn to discipline themselves.
And when we're disciplining ourselves, we're doing two things. We're setting the example for them of a life of discipline, and we're showing them that by making right choices, that there are blessings that come. The scriptures are very clear. If you make the wrong choices, then the curses are going to come. You make the right choices, what's going to come?
Yeah.
The blessings.
In other words, this is where the text, it says, don't kid putting it in vernacular, don't kid yourself. What? God is not mocked. You can fool yourself, you can fool everybody else, but ultimately, what we put into life is what we get out. And probably discipline. Some people go, how will I discipline my child? We can't know how to discipline our children until we understand what discipline is for. Discipline is so our children will learn through their lives that this brings that, so that they can think.
There's a consequence to every action. Every action creates a reaction.
And so the issue is, if we choose the right things, we get the right result. Somebody said, I don't know who made it up, they said insanity is the mindset that says that I'll do the same thing every time and expect different results. But that can never be.
We live in a world to a certain degree is out of control. And if there ever was a time that there's no discipline. And our judicial system testifies that to a large degree. Young kids can go out and commit terrible crimes, and they act like, yeah, we got caught. But most of the time it's like we can get away with it. Even if we get caught, we can get out of it. And we are in a society that discipline is such an important part of the element of life that we need to bring back into our family. And starting with our small toddlers up, and you and I are going to clarify again, we're not talking about beating kids and being harsh. We're talking about an educational process. Discipline is education. What is it? Discipline is education. Our time is just about out. If you've enjoyed this program, you have any comments, or if you'd like to get our magazines and catalogs for Laymen Ministries, I would just encourage you to write Laymen Ministries, 414 Zapata Road, and that's St. Mary's, Idaho, 83861, or call our toll-free number, which is 1-800-245-1844.